All for One and One for All, commemorating NATO's 75th anniversary in 2024.
To celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO, the Atlantic Council of the United Kingdom has been privileged to hear from various eminent speakers discussing the strength of the alliance through collective values. From NATO itself to senior officials from Ukraine and the Atlantic Council's own researchers, we hope you enjoy this film celebrating the alliance and the principles of democracy, individual liberty and the rule of law. Slava Ukraini.
Dr. Jamie Shea, former NATO spokesman, sends this message. Congratulations for producing this film to mark NATO's 75th anniversary. NATO has a long and rich history. It has had to overcome many crises and constantly adapt to meet new challenges and stay relevant in the evolving security landscape. Yet in a world today marked by great power rivalries, wars of aggression, cyber attacks, disinformation, and interference campaigns, ever faster technology change, and global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and terrorism, the challenges that NATO will need arguably even more formidable than those that kept it busy in the past. So we need to hold on to NATO and keep it strong and vibrant to keep us secure. It is essential to comprehend NATO's existence and the reason for its continuance to examine the historical background to the formation of NATO and to the formative years in history before that.
The NATO organisation was formed at the end of the Second World War, and as we know from history, the Second World War was a war in a sense to end all wars after the First World War, Mr. Buckle. And it was an idea of President Roosevelt that after that war that there should be no more wars if diplomacy and statesmen could help it. And the nations got together, and the old allies got together, and they formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, under which all those members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation gave a solemn promise. And they said that the parties under Article 5 agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, to assist the party or parties attacked by taking forthwith individually and in concert with the other parties such action as deems necessary. Again, question mark. Is it necessary? Is it necessary for an individual member? Or is it necessary because of collective security? We saw in the 1930s how difficult it was with the League of Nations to enforce the means of collective security because nations' interests diverged, especially when Italy, Japan and Germany left the League of Nations. So, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area.
I think it's important to look back at the past to understand how we've got to where we are today to develop the most successful strategies moving forward.
If we stand united, Europe and North America, we can face every challenge as we have done over the past 75 years.
The other half of the walnut, as President Truman described it, was the security side and the promise from the United States at that time that it would intervene in the event of a European war, so we wouldn't see a return to US isolationism as we had in the wake of World War I.
treaty we are signing here today is evidence of the path they will follow. It is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
It was extraordinarily important, the creation of the alliance, and has been since then, because it's the only organization that offers hope that peace can become a real possibility, not just regionally, but more far-reaching than that.
There were Soviet troops across Central and Eastern Europe, so they didn't really have a choice in joining this alliance. It was nothing like NATO, which had been formed years before, with democracies choosing to join.
But I think what's key here with the Berlin Wall and what Churchill dubbed the Iron Curtain is actually how little contact there was for so many years between Eastern and Western Europe. And people growing up on both sides of the Iron Curtain had the threat of mutually assured destruction.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
People look at the Cold War and they assume that nothing happened, that it was static. But it wasn't static. It was a continuous discussion of security issues and the best ways that allies should address these security issues.
NATO protects and has provided strength through collective values for 75 years. Its success is unparalleled and has helped to preserve peace, thus safeguarding the values of freedom, tolerance and democracy, the preservation of which require constant vigilance shared by all members of the alliance. A truly all-for-one and one-for-all arrangement which strengthens our mutual security, which is ultimately guaranteed by the treaty's Article 5, which states that an attack on one is an attack on all, a strong deterrent against any hostile aggression. NATO protects and has provided strength through security through collective values for 75 years, but to understand why this is and how it came about, we need to delve into the historic origins of the alliance. Not just its creation in 1949 following the horrors and conflicts of World War and to curtail the aggressive occupation of European countries by the Soviet Union, but to examine its deeper historic origin in the interwar years. Many interpretations of these events are controversial and the subject is complex, but what we do know is that out of this complexity was born an organisation which has preserved our security and continues to provide meaningful and relevant protection for all its members.
Professor Reynolds, thank you for coming to talk to us. I've just read your latest book, which is widely acclaimed on the historical background to the Cold War, the close of the Second World War, and so on. Do you think NATO's survival and prosperity over 75 years has been the result of shared values, common beliefs, or has it merely survived through events such as Hungary, the Cold War, Prague, Berlin, and now most recently Ukraine? Is there a balance between the two? Are they interwoven? What is the secret of NATO's success?
Well, I think it's an outstanding historical success because it's unprecedented in the history of diplomacy or warfare, in the sense that if you look at the period between the wars, between the Great War, 1914 to 1939 basically, we never had collective security. We couldn't secure collective security. There was no real firm alliance. NATO has been highly successful in securing that alliance because, as you referred to, the common values, the shared values, what are they? Democracy, yeah? The rule of law. And we all believe in self-determination. Something that Woodrow Wilson referred to in his 17 points in 1918, which was the foundation stone for some form of amnesty or whatever, the eventual termination of the First World War, and the agreement with the Germans that they would surrender, basically. But we never actually achieved a good, worthwhile, sustainable alliance. NATO has been able to achieve it. Why? What states have you got in NATO? You've got the United States, you've got England, shared common values, democracy, the rule of law, the common law as well, indeed. France, yes, and the other members of NATO who've joined after 1949, after the Treaty of Washington and so forth. To what extent, you say, have events changed NATO, the focus and so forth? Have the events tempered NATO? Have they forged NATO into a different form? Well, I think basically, if you go back to the Treaty of Washington, it remains the same alliance, the Atlantic Alliance, to protect the interests of Europe and the Atlantic Alliance, as it were. And what is remarkable is you've maintained the interest of the United States and the importance of the United States in underpinning that alliance, which we never had in the centuries before. We never had that. We did have, may I mention, a secret alliance with the United States, which many people don't know about, which our Foreign Secretary, Castlereagh, agreed with the American President. And indeed, I think it was Canning, actually, who drafted the Monroe Doctrine, if all's been known.
This is the 1820s.
This was the 1820s.
Yes.
And you know what it was? The British fleet will guarantee the independence of America and ensure that no foreign state gets into the Americas. Save, of course, the British interest in, whatever it was. But things sort of changed. So we gave them, if you like, security in the 19th century, right up to at least 1875, 76, I wrote in the previous book. And then it sort of changed. But the relationship became a special relationship, so-called, and that underpins it. But what is the special relationship? It's the relationship that statesmen have with each other and understand each other. And that harmonises that relationship. Bismarck once said, of course, the greatest thing in history was that we both spoke the same language, but we both had the same religion, the same common law, and that's what united us. The great benefit of NATO was to deter the Soviets ever thinking about taking any part of Western Europe. Same as sort of takeover like Hitler tried to do, etc., etc. So there was a certain balance of power only achieved not because Britain and France had an alliance, but because of NATO. And without NATO, we wouldn't have had that balance of power, so that the Soviets would not risk a war with any of the Western countries because of the NATO guarantee, which is the Treaty of Washington. So that's what preserved the balance of power, if you like, in Europe. Now, we never had any direct attack on any state in Europe after the Soviet Soviet territory receded. Now, if you take the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then Gorbachev having reset the relationship with America and Europe and so forth, and then Soviet power receded, or appeared to. What happened then? Those states voluntarily became members of NATO. We didn't force them into it. They feared that they would be taken over again by Soviets, and they would be Soviet-dominated, back to autocracy again.
Indeed.
That was the key point. Hence the point about values. Hence the point about democracy, self-determination, and the rule of law. And that's what they wanted. And they joined us of their own free will. So today we come up to the present position where we have a non-NATO country, Ukraine, which is fighting for its independence and democracy. Now, its own democracy has got to grow. It's not quite there yet, but it would, given time, grow into a proper democratic state. But like Czechoslovakia in 1938, it's being deprived of its freedom to progress. Unlike 1938, because of NATO, because of the Treaty of Washington, the Article 5, etc., NATO has said this is a state in trouble, all the West agrees, and therefore we will give them the weapons to defend themselves. Not much different from Franklin Roosevelt saying, let's give Britain Lend-Lease, because Roosevelt realised that without Lend-Lease, without armaments produced en masse, critically, industrial production and so forth, which only America could do, free of all the bombs and everything, Britain could survive. And because of that, we were able to re-equip, and we did survive, thank goodness. And then America did come in. With Ukraine, we're under no legal obligation to defend them, unless, of course, the Soviets, the Russians, are so stupid as to launch an attack on a NATO country. Now, that could happen because some of their drones are flying over Poland, for instance. But I think we've got to lay it down. I think they do lay it down. There's a red line there. And in order to make sure that there is a viable red line, you need to have the deterrent forces in position along that line to say, you dare cross it, and we're at war. There can be no other view. We can't take the Chamberlain type view, appeasement and all that sort of stuff. Enough is enough. Because if you don't stand on it, and you take action, if you fail to take action, then your guarantee, your word would be not worth a light. And the more you give in to a dictator, we learn from the 30s, the worse it becomes, the more power to them. What do? Propaganda, subterfuge. There's enough of that going on. And that's it. And there's another aspect of this. So we may not have a declared war with Russia at the moment, obviously not. But there is maybe this, that during the Spanish Civil War, Italy, the Nazis, and Russia armed various sides in that dispute. It was, in essence, a proxy war. And it was a trial for what Hitler's Luftwaffe would do later on. That's where they got their experience. Now, in some respects, there is a certain parallel with Ukraine. It's a dangerous parallel, but nevertheless it's there. And I think one of the problems today is that I think that people who don't know very much history, don't know the way the world works sometimes, neglect to look back at history and say, well, we can't predict what's going to happen, but what do we do to prevent the worst scenario? Come back to NATO. NATO must maintain its strength, and so far it's succeeded enormously, because we've now got Norway, we've got Sweden, and Sweden produces some very good armaments, if I may say so. And you've got Poland, and Poland is stepping up with 6% GDP on armaments. And I used to work for a Polish lawyer who was formerly Polish Armament Division, and I'm quite sure that Poland would have no question about what its obligations would be in the event of any attack or whatever. So I'm pretty confident that there is unity amongst the powers that form NATO. There is a common interest, and everyone realises that if they don't maintain that deterrent value, the same values we have, etc., then what do you get in return? If you don't maintain it, I'll tell you where you go. You go back to 1914 or 1939, probably 1939, and you get the same old story. And then we have the propaganda saying, oh yeah, but they've got the West weapons and all that, but they shouldn't use them in Russia. When Roosevelt gave us Lend-Lease, he didn't say to Winston Churchill, well, these bombs, by the way, they're for home use. Or these B-29s, you can just use them to fly around the British Isles, you know? These ships, by the way, no, you can't use these 51 destroyers we're giving you. Don't use those for any aggression against U-boats. No. He didn't say that. He knew war was war. NATO represents a strong deterrent, a clear deterrent, and it must maintain its position. I see no other alternative. You must step up to the plate. I think people must be determined to have the courage to say this far and no further. That's what I've got to do.
Well, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.
If there is anything certain today, if there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
The Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
Of a world torn apart, a pact of protection, a collective heart. Berlin's blockade we airlifted through, a signal to the world of what we do. From Cold War standoffs to the skies of Kosovo, we've stood for peace where others won't go. It's one for all, and all for one, under the shield of NATO's sun. The bond of trust, the strength we've sown. Together we're stronger, together we've grown. 9/11 struck, we answered the call. Article 5, we were there for them all. From Bosnia's streets to Afghanistan's plains, we've weathered the storm, endured the pains. Through cyber realms and hybrid threats, our unity's bond has no regrets. A growing alliance to silence the beast. From peace in the Balkans to Ukraine's fight, we stand unwavering for what is right. It's one for all and all for one. Under the shield of NATO's sun, the bond of trust, the strength we've sown. Together we're stronger, together we've grown. 75 years our journey's defined by freedom and justice, values entwined. From treaties signed to battles unknown, a legacy timeless, the seeds we've sown. 75 years our journey's defined by freedom and justice, values entwined. From treaties signed to battles unknown, a legacy timeless, the seeds we've sown.
I was a reporter in 1991 when the war broke out. So I started reporting from Yugoslavia when it was Yugoslavia. The NATO Secretary General in the 1990s, Manfred Wörner, was really committed to NATO doing what it could to intervene and to halt the conflict. And Manfred Wörner came literally from his deathbed to chair meetings of the North Atlantic Council in which he was arguing for a more robust NATO intervention, which eventually came in 1995.
NATO has been asked to act, and NATO will act. Our objective is to protect the safe areas against attacks so that the word safe really means what it says. Safe.
The NATO operation was the key to ending the Bosnian War in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
We must stop the violence and bring an end to the humanitarian catastrophe now taking place in Kosovo.
That was a very clear response to avoid ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. So there is a responsibility to protect, and I think that showed, certainly in the Western Balkans, the importance of concerted international action at an early stage.
NATO has provided for the past 25 years an important presence which contributes to the conditions for a peace process to take place, firstly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but then subsequently also in Kosovo after a far greater NATO intervention in 1999.
We had the accession of the first three former communist countries, Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, joining in 1999. And then in 2004, 7 more countries joined in what was known as the Big Bang accession. And being there and watching the flags of Romania, but all the other countries that joined at the same time, was probably one of the most emotional moments in my life. These were countries that were part of the European, the Euro-Atlantic family that had been kept apart for so many decades, who are now coming home.
The countries who wished to join NATO after the Cold War were those countries who believed they had their sovereignty taken away from them, and they would look to NATO as a guarantor to protect them so that they would maintain that sovereignty in the future.
"9/11 changed everything, And it proved that the existence of NATO needed to continue.
NATO solidarity remains the essence of our alliance. Our message to the people of the United States is that we are with you. Our message to those who perpetrated these unspeakable crimes is equally clear. You will not get away with it."
That was really a huge wake-up call that business as usual, obviously, wasn't going to continue.
If it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
The Alliance voted unanimously to apply Article 5. That was very meaningful to us.
there has been no other terrorist attack on our nations from Afghanistan. That security objective was achieved. The mission morphed into something closer to democracy building, and I think we were not able to achieve that goal. And I think we've also learned a lot from that mission.
NATO allies stand behind the legitimate aspirations of the Libyan people for freedom, democracy, and human rights.
I remember being at NATO headquarters practically all the time. There was very intense discussions. How do we know that those little green men in uniforms without insignia are actually Russian soldiers? But for the first time, we started using satellite imagery much more deliberately. We were exposing Russia's plans, Russia's intentions, and Russia's actions. I feel this is an existential moment, so what we do or don't do will change the face of the world for generations to come.
Russia has attacked Ukraine. Peace on our continent has been shattered. We now have war in Europe on a scale we thought belonged to history.
There is a responsibility to protect, and I think that showed, certainly in the Western Balkans, the importance of concerted international action.
The war in Ukraine and rising tensions with China, Iran, and other threats to global security show that threats to our way of life and values remain constant and require continued vigilance. Therefore, looking to the future, it's crucial that we build on the success of the last 75 years to maintain and strengthen NATO, the most successful military alliance in history.
Now, it strikes me that the greatest challenge since 1949 is that in Eastern Europe, because for the first time since 1945, we have a war on the doorstep of Europe, and nations have got to decide what they're going to do in that respect. So the nations have come forward and said, members of NATO are supporting the beleaguered state of Ukraine, which is heavily outgunned by Russia. But when you try to appease a dictator, he becomes more confident and he becomes more powerful, and they usually win what they're going to do. So it doesn't make any sense that we just appease the aggressor. Because if we appease the aggressor, what happens? Forget sovereignty entirely, forget international rule of law, forget independence and those type of things, and therefore forget everything that's been in the rule book since the Treaty of Versailles, basically, with the rule of self-determination. We've never had a challenge as serious, in my opinion, as we have today, and that requires the nations, members of NATO, to think very seriously about the contribution they make towards peace. Now, the fundamental point I'd make is that the great mistake of 1938 and 39 was the fact that Britain and France at that point thought that they could appease the dictator. The only way you can stop a dictator and an aggressor like that is when he sees that the risk of fighting you is not going to be worth taking, and he's going to lose. So you have to ensure that your forces are strong enough to deter an aggressor. Because if you haven't got that means of deterrence, your foreign policy is frankly worthless in my view. So without NATO, what would be the British power of persuasion, there'd be very little without NATO. So it's fundamental to our security that we are a member of NATO and we retain NATO membership.
In his speech on the 26th of May announcing the date of the UK general election, Mr Sunak warned that the world is more dangerous than it's been since the end of the Cold War. And 6 weeks later, upon entering Downing Street, Sir Keir encouraged the nation to, in his words, face down, as we have so often in our past, the challenges of an increasingly insecure world. YouGov released a poll during the election campaign showing that more than half of the British population fears that a world war is coming in the next 5 to 10 years and that we are not ready for it. We need a muscular foreign policy, but a muscular foreign policy isn't cheap. And this is the first challenge that the Starmer government is already facing. We've already seen growing public opposition to defence spending, partly due to the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, and partly due to a growing war fatigue over Ukraine. If you look at the BBC news article today, there's an article about Sir Keir sending 650 missiles to Ukraine. Read the comments in there about how it's pensioners who are having money snatched from them to fund foreign wars of the riots. But we've seen wider anti-West, anti-American, anti-British and anti-NATO discourses and rhetoric accelerating, a social media-enabled acceleration that NATO started the war in Ukraine. We'll see in a couple of months' time with the United States elections, Britain is not the only NATO member to be facing increasingly loud calls for reductions in defence spending and foreign defensive aid. And Keir Starmer is certainly far from being the only leader of a NATO country being roundly criticised by large segments of his population for foreign policy stances. Only, precisely as my colleague said, only the protection afforded by NATO can prevent the Russians from regrouping and invading again, because we all know what a treaty with the Kremlin is worth. It isn't worth the pixels that it's printed on. Only the military protection of NATO can protect Ukraine and Europe. And in January 2024, the former Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps of the Conservative government, he spoke at Lancaster House in January 2024, warning that the United Kingdom, along with our allies, is, in his words, moving from a post-war to a pre-war world. If he was right, and he is no more clairvoyant than any of us, but he was the Foreign Secretary, if he was right, then Keir Starmer's legacy in the history books may be, as a Prime Minister, more akin to Neville Chamberlain than to Clement Attlee, frantically scrambling to rebuild our defences and our relationships and reputation with our equally worn-out allies in Europe, in North America and around the world, and rebuilding our reputation against our posturing adversaries in Pyongyang, Tehran, Beijing and Moscow.
People need to wake up.
They do.
I mean, Churchill wrote a book, While England Slept. I've got it at home. He wrote another book called Step by Step, all his speeches about warning Mr. Chamberlain and the others. Jack Kennedy, Why England Slept. His thesis, wasn't it, at Harvard or something, which I've got as well. And all these people, he was writing after the event, but Churchill was writing as it was. And you've got to see it as it is. And people have to be told the truth.
They do.
And it's bad, so Starmer comes out and says, we've got no money, basically. Okay, it's telling the truth. I don't get a good backlash from that, but you've got to make people realise that democracy is hanging by a thread.
It really is.
As I'm sure anyone in this room can appreciate, in the last few years, the terms security and defence have become increasingly blurred. We live in an era of hybrid warfare, of state-backed actors trying to destabilise democracy and undermine the rule of law, weaponising information, cyber attacks, economic pressures and sanctions on both sides, and, as we've seen from Russia, the continued use of hard military power. Now more than ever, I think we all need to take stock on what we stand for, how we work together to defend what we stand for, and what institutions like NATO bring to the table. I've been involved in the Atlantic Council for about 10 years now, and I've really seen a narrative shift in how NATO is perceived and appreciated now more than ever as a critical institution to our collective defence, reflected in the fact that the alliance has grown materially in the last 10 years to its current 32 members or allies. We at the Atlantic Council champion NATO and transatlanticism, but what does that mean? Well, time and again, I find myself looking back to the North Atlantic Treaty itself. And I want to just read out to you the preamble from the treaty before handing over to Arda. The parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all people and governments. They're determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage and civilization of their peoples. They seek, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty and the rule of law. They seek to promote stability and well-being in the North Atlantic area. They're resolved to unite their efforts for collective defence and for the preservation of peace and security.
On deterrence and defence, I think what I'd like you to leave this meeting is the notion that now NATO sees itself as in a new era of collective defense. We are talking about modernizing our collective defense system. We are talking about modernizing our collective defense architecture, forces and capabilities. Now, in all honesty, this is not something new. NATO began this march in the aftermath of the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. But it's also fair to say that a lot of the efforts we've been undertaking have been accelerated as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So the foundations were there, but our leaders have taken decisions to accelerate NATO's adaptation. So essentially, we now have combat-ready forces throughout NATO's eastern flank. We used to have 4 battle groups. We now have 8. They are in a position to be scaled up to brigade size, and we are exercising the scale up every year. So in 2024, I believe 7 out of the 8 brigades will have been scaled up to brigade size. That is a sizable combat-ready force on the eastern flank. We have now, across the alliance, 500,000 troops on high readiness. That number was 300,000 only a couple of years ago, and much lower before all of the war in Ukraine happened. So now we have, the number is 500,000 across various levels of high readiness. What we have is a new generation of defense plans that I'll maybe talk a bit more detail about. But the key is that these plans are now anchoring and driving our adaptation going forward. Those are really key elements, driving things like forces, capabilities, command and control, long-term force planning, how we work and with our defense industry, how we work across the whole of government to build resilience, and how we think about what we call enablement logistics, being able to move our forces to make sure that they're at the right place at the right time, equipped with the right force munitions and other elements that are required. And fourthly, NATO is exercising at a scale and frequency which has not been seen for decades. You might have seen the active communications we've done around Steadfast Defender. This was the largest demonstration of reinforcement, particularly transatlantic reinforcement, for many decades. It also allowed us to stress test the challenges, shortfalls we have in things like enabling the theater so we can move our forces rapidly where they are needed. All of this, of course, is underpinned by resources and capabilities. Now we have 23 allies who have reached the 2% guideline, which was set in in Wales in 2014. And there is broad recognition that this is a floor, and in many cases, allies have to go above the 2%. Not only to meet the new requirements, but also to compensate for years of underinvestment in the period after the Cold War.
75 years into the NATO alliance, why do you think that America is shifting its sort of commitment to NATO? Do you think it's to do with the Pacific challenge and China, the rise of China, or do you think it's more to do with isolationism, preferences, or what's your view?
You ask there, why is America maybe moving away from NATO? I agree, it's a combination of the pivot to Asia and a lack of trust in states and in isolationism, but I think there's also a third reason for it. And I think that we can find the origins of this, funnily enough, here in the United Kingdom with Brexit. Now, whatever our thoughts on Brexit, I am firmly of the opinion that if we had had a referendum in 2016 on membership of the United Nations, on membership of the International Postal and Telegraph Union, or membership of the International Red Cross, we would have voted to leave. It didn't matter what we were voting to leave. Remember that the number one question Googled in the United Kingdom the next day was, what is the EU? So I think that we've got a similar thing going on with the United States and NATO. Before Brexit, and I did my work on symbols, before Brexit, you never really thought about the European Union in this country. It would crop up from time to time on the front page of a tabloid, but you never really thought about it. Before the invasion of Ukraine, we never really thought about NATO. Nobody at the moment thinks about their country's membership of the United Nations General Assembly. It becomes a magnet for everyone's frustrations, resentments, anxieties. It brings me back to emotion. So why are the Americans turning against NATO? Not because they don't like NATO, not because they oppose Article 5 or they don't want to send troops overseas. It's, right, we've got this thing, this phenomenon, which is just a magnet for all of our resentments, frustrations, anger and hatred in our own society. It's not specific to NATO, it's just a general lack of knowledge of what these institutions and organisations are and seeing them as a scapegoat for all of their problems.
If we don't spend more together now to prevent war, we will pay a much, much, much higher price later to fight it. We also need modern capabilities that use the most advanced technologies, and we need them now.
So all for one and one for all is the central theme of this video, and it's the founding principle of NATO based on Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all, and it's still as essential as it was in 1949 as it is today.
The torch we bear through storms of conflict, the world we've shared. From the ashes of war, we made a vow to defend our freedoms here and now. Through the darkest nights, we stood as one. For peace and hope, our work's never done. The battles change, but the call's the same. Together we rise, united in name. Together we stand, stronger than fear. A shield over all, the future is clear. Through every test, through time's command, we rise as allies. Together we stand. To sea and to skies above, we fight not for power but what we love. decades past will guide us forward, strong and steadfast. Together we stand, stronger than fear, a shield of resolve, the future is clear. Through every test, through time's command, we rise as allies, together we stand. Through rising tides and shifting sands, we build the future with open hands.
Peace and security safeguard our values of democracy, freedom of speech and tolerance. The preservation of those values 75 years onwards depends on this.
Final, together we stand. The future we see, a promise of peace for you and for me. Through every trial, through every land, we rise as allies, together we stand. Together we stand. 75 years, the torch we bear. A brighter tomorrow built through care. One for all and all for one. Our journey continues. The work's just begun. 75 years, the torch we bear. A brighter tomorrow built through care.
The dangers arising from conflict in the world today are greater than ever, and the need for NATO is correspondingly greater as we move on from this 75th year. The military threats are acute and our defences need strengthening. In addition to the military threats, our shared values are constantly assaulted by the spread of dangerous and subversive woke ideologies, as much a threat to our perceptions of security as to our values. Yet in all this conflict, NATO continues to prosper and protect. In this special year, there is perhaps one other additional and important simple message, and that is, congratulations NATO on your 75th anniversary, and thank you.
One for all and all for one. Our journey continues.